Hi, my name is Bob Sutton. I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar. And what I'm going to do today is, for the next 40 minutes or so, talk about some ideas that my colleague Huggy Rao and I spent about 7 years developing, and to sort of give you a bit of context. Huggy and I are both essentially management or professors. I study more the psychology of work. He studies more the sociology of work. And we do a lot of different programs together, including we lead one executive program called Customer Focused Innovation, in which we try to get participants to think about how they can develop and spread innovations and ideas to essentially please customers and have more empathy for them. And in the process of doing this program in about 2006, we noticed that people kept asking the same question, which was, there's a little pocket of my organization, a little place, maybe an office, maybe a little group where people are really great at pleasing and anticipating the needs of customers. The challenge is, how do we spread it more widely throughout the organization? And so we didn't have very good answers, so we started thinking about that. And we started doing case studies, we started scouring the academic literature, and along the way, over the last 6 or 7 years, we built sort of, I would describe it as a cadre of 40 or 50 folks who in various ways had faced similar problems. So essentially, that's what the book is about, and here's the book, which just came out a couple months ago. And to give you a sense of the challenge that we tried to wrestle with in this book, Scaling Up Excellence, is essentially you've got an organization, maybe a network of organizations, and there's a little pocket of goodness, something that's really quite excellent. How do you spread it from the few that have it to the many who need it? And how do you do it in such a way, and we're jokingly calling this webinar Scaling Up Without Screwing Up, but I would say, how do you do it without messing up less, because it's impossible to do it without making a lot of mistakes, frankly. And let me give you some examples. One of the examples we talk about a lot in the book is a little startup that came out of Stanford called Pulse. They were recently acquired by LinkedIn for $90 million. Started by two guys, Ankit and Akshay, two students. And we kind of tracked them as they went from 4 to 20 employees. It was really quite interesting. The growing pains they have is they just added a few people. So that would be one example. Sort of a crazy example. Got something like McDonald's, which is in the process of opening some 1,500 stores in China. Another example, for those of you interested in spreading innovation, a big interest of ours, there's one of the heroes in the book is a woman named Claudia Kachka. She started out with just a little group in Procter & Gamble that was trying to be more customer-focused. And in fact, their first client was Mr. Clean, which in those days was just liquid cleaners. And she helped them by being more customer-focused, develop all these products. And now there's actually some 300 people throughout Procter & Gamble who do essentially innovation or customer-focused design, a group that she helped create and lead. And then finally, one of our favorite and most important examples, which is in the U.S., as much as we hear about how bad our healthcare system is, there is some good news. One of the case studies that we did and we've had extensive conversations with is something called the 100,000 Lives campaign. And what happened was a small nonprofit out of Boston called the Institute for Health Improvement led an effort to spread actually very simple measures that reduced the number of deaths in U.S. hospitals. Things like getting doctors and nurses to wash their hands, things that simple. And it looks like, and my colleague Huggy Rao, who's a great quantitative researcher, has some evidence that it looks like these changes did probably save about 100,000 lives. But in all these cases, although they vary, the challenge is, how do you spread something good from the few to the many? So the book has lots of ideas, but if we were going to pick our core message, is that one of the things about scaling, people tend to view or think of scaling as just doing more and more and more and more of something, and that's part of it. We describe that as sort of creating a footprint, but the other part of it is also this notion that when you're spreading something good, what really propels it and sustains it is the mindset, the set of behaviors and beliefs that people live and accept. And in particular, the question we tend to ask when we go into organizations to get a sense of them is, what is sacred here and what is taboo? So this isn't in the slide deck, but just to throw in a quick example, pardon me, about 6 weeks ago, I was giving a talk at Amazon. It's a diverse group. It's called their Fishbowl for authors, about 160, 170 folks. And people were everything from the grocery business to the book business. They have a new grocery business to people in the server business. They kind of do a lot of stuff like that. And I asked them what's sacred here and what's taboo. And even though they're from many different businesses, they said what's sacred at Amazon is the customer, and they really do mean that if you've ever dealt with Amazon, and what's taboo is wasting money. They're one of the cheapest organizations I've ever dealt with in my life. But one thing that helped is everybody understood where they were supposed to devote their attention. Another example, and this one's important, not just because Facebook's sort of one of the modern darlings, but it's also important because one of the things that we always found was that especially when organizations scaled very quickly, grew very quickly, that having a focus on keeping everybody on the same page in terms of this notion of what's sacred and what's taboo, and instilling the same mindset in them was really important to propel growth, especially as you're adding people quickly. So, and you can see the numbers, how quickly they grew. And one thing they do at Facebook, and I just checked a couple weeks ago, they're still doing it, is when you are brought in as a new engineer, what they do is they have an idea sort of what your job is going to be, but they're not completely sure. And what they'll do is they'll give you 12 or 13 little assignments to actually code, make changes in the website. And so what you're doing is you're living the move fast and break things mindset. And so they talk about it a little bit, but what's happening is they're really sort of instilling it in people. And when we ask Chris Cox, who's quoted here on the slide, who's now, he keeps getting different jobs, but now he's head of product. Essentially, he's been sitting next to Mark Zuckerberg for 10 years. I think that's the most important fact about him. He's been called various things, but he usually sits next to Mark all day. And so his definition of a successful first week at Facebook is you've made a change that you can, in the website, that you can show your parents. I thought that was sort of cute. Now, one thing that I hasten to add is that successful mindsets will vary depending on the nature of the business. So when I was talking to a VMware executive about the move fast and break things mindset, his perspective was that that might be great for Facebook, but we can't use it in our business. For example, they make software for nuclear submarines, and move fast and break things does not seem like a good idea in that situation. The one constant, though, we do tend to see, to quote Brad Bird, the famous director from Pixar, he's done Ratatouille, The Incredibles, is there's this kind of relentless restlessness, this feeling that things are never quite good enough and we've always got to keep improving. But again, the key idea here is that in order to scale excellence, one of the things that propels it is this really clear notion of what's sacred and what's taboo in an organization. Okay, so here's essentially the little agenda we're going to go through. Let me start out with our big lessons. We've got two of them that are important. Our first big lesson is that when we look to see what kind of propels the spread of excellence in organizations, we see organizations where people have what we would call felt accountability. Another way to put it is something happens in the organization, so people have the feeling that I own the place and therefore I have to do my job really well, and also that the place owns you. And so there's a sense of mutual obligation where everybody feels not only obligated to do their job well, but to teach and to even criticize coworkers who are not performing up to snuff or need to learn something to do their job better. And just one quick example, we've got this little study done by a consortium of hospitals to try to figure out, well, what is it about the 15% of U.S. hospitals where when a patient is, unfortunately is dying or has in some cases just already died, and the organs can be harvested to help save other people's lives? In most hospitals, in that situation, is about 50% of the time they're successful getting permission and harvesting the organs. But there's a few hospitals that have over a 75% rate, and what's special about them? And in those hospitals, this study indicated they had kind of an all-teach, all-learn kind of mindset, and everybody in the hospital who could possibly have an impact was involved, not just the doctors and the nurses, the receptionists, the clergy, and they would have sort of frequent huddle meetings to figure out how we can all work together to make sure that this happens. And that feeling of sort of mutual responsibility, all teach, all learn, is the hallmark for us of organizations that spread excellence, one of the hallmarks. And the other thing, of course, you see here is that scaling starts and ends with those individuals. It's not just something that comes down from on high. The second big lesson is that, as we put it, is that scaling is a problem of both more and less. So when we think of scaling, we think of adding more and more and more and more. But along the way, things build up, or you do stuff that you probably should get rid of. And so the best leaders and teams are constantly thinking about what they can subtract, what they can remove from the system, to give you, and of course all sorts of things build up that we forget about. Here's this little cartoon which I bought it from the New Yorker permission years ago, so I love using it. They're wearing the stupid hats, and it says, I don't know how it started either. All I know is it's part of our corporate culture. And there are many things that become part of a corporate culture that sort of become like this baggage that we all drag with us. And in good organizations, people are constantly mindful about what to get rid of. Sometimes, of course, this reaches extreme levels. There was this, of course, incredible incident in the U.S. about 8 years ago when essentially the President of the United States fired the CEO of General Motors and brought in a guy, Ed Whitaker, who had been CEO of AT&T. And Ed did a pretty good job of kind of running around GM, which is at least was a very ossified organization, in getting rid of things. And you can see the example in the R&D organization. They cut the number of reports from 94 to 4. The other thing that happens is that as organizations grow, things that really were useful at one stage start becoming a hindrance at another stage. So the sort of famous saying you sometimes see in the management literature, what got you here won't get you there. One organization that I've been involved in since the 90s is IDEO. It's led by David Kelly. David's the founder of IDEO, also the primary founder of the Stanford D School or Hasso-Plattner Institute of Design that was mentioned in the introduction. And in the mid-90s, I used to go to all-hands meetings in Palo Alto on Mondays, and they looked, you can see the pictures, this is pretty much how things look. Usually we'd be lying around some cold, ugly warehouse, and you can see the guy lying in the middle who looks like Groucho Marx, that's David Kelly. And David would just do this masterful job of leading a meeting with 150 or with 60 people, and everybody would feel included, and he'd mention most people's names, and he'd kind of leave being charged up. But then when IDEO hit 150, that didn't work at all, and they had to divide it up. And this happens classically in organizations. And finally, and this is the really tough stuff to get rid of, is in many organizations, things are done that, well, just because everybody else doesn't, supposedly you have to have them. And my favorite example is performance evaluations. If you looked at research on performance evaluation, if you sort of think of it as a drug, it would not get government approval, FDA approval, to be spread on the market as sort of a cure for anything, because about 40% of the time it makes things better, 40% of the time it makes things worse, and 20% of the time it has little effect at all. So there are some organizations that are starting to have the courage to get rid of performance evaluations and replace them with something else. A good example is, this is one of the heroes of our book, Donna Morris, who's head of HR of Adobe. Donna looked at the numbers, and every year around performance evaluation time, they discovered that their best people would leave at an increased rate, that employee satisfaction would go throughout the firm, and that it took 80,000 person hours. So they got rid of them and switched to a system of sort of constant check-ins. And they essentially, is the way she put it, we took the forms away from the managers, and we required them to talk to employees about how they were doing. It's more complicated than that. They did a bunch of changes, but right now we're actually in the middle of doing a more in-depth case study, and it's described in the book. There's a couple pages in the book. But essentially, all the evidence is that there's all sorts of positive consequences. People like the new system better, and in particular, if you will, the right people are leaving and the right people are staying. And so this is one of those cases where they kind of had the courage to get rid of something that was causing friction and to spread excellence. Okay, let me talk a little bit before we get to the principles about the key choice point. in the process of doing this book, there was lots of little different decisions that we looked at that are important for spreading excellence, but there was one that just came up over and over and over again and never goes away. And we're not trying to like be overly serious about this, but the analogy we use is Catholicism versus Buddhism. So as you scale, there's just about always this decision, which is how much standardization, or what we call Catholicism, would you have in an organization as you spread different ways of doing stuff, or would you have a general sort of approach or set of beliefs and sort of allow local variations. Is our friend Michael Deering, a venture capitalist who came up with this distinction, former altar boy of the month, he always likes to point out. Michael Deering says, in some organizations you have a few general beliefs and people can do what they want. In other organizations you have a very refined playbook. If you want an example of an organization out here in the West that has a very, very standardized approach, every store is pretty much exactly the same. You can see In-N-Out Burger. That's their entire menu right there. Very few ingredients. They're owned by, all stores are owned by the corporation. And if any of you have ever been to an In-N-Out Burger, the employees seem to look the same and act the same in the sort of a universally sort of perky, sort of upbeat, helpful way. They are very clear about who they are, and it's very consistent across locations. There does sometimes turn into a problem, though, when you try to replicate things exactly every place you go. Sometimes something that works great in one place will not work in other places. A great example is what happened when Home Depot went into China, the Chinese market. Home Depot in the United States is a do-it-yourself sort of store. You go there, you buy the stuff, you assemble it or do whatever at home, do your home maintenance project. Well, in China, which is rather than a do-it-yourself culture, it's mostly a do-it-for-me culture. They opened 12 stores in China, and they all ended up closing them in the last few years. They're all gone because it did not work in that culture. And one of my Chinese students, as he put it, if in China, in addition to having a do-it-for-me culture, in general, if you have enough money to shop at Home Depot, you have enough money to pay somebody to do the work. So, so culturally, it just didn't work. In contrast, IKEA, which has been fantastically successful in China, they kind of sell the same stuff they do everywhere else in the world. There's a few custom products for the market, but not many. But the main difference in terms of what happens in China is that they put in better delivery and assembly services than anywhere else in the world, so they customize it to the culture. And just as a kind of cute example that we talk about in the book, there's a hotel chain out here in the western United States called Joie de Vivre Hotel, started by a guy named Chip Conley. He actually recently sold it to Hyatt and is now a senior executive at Airbnb, but he spent some 25 years, at least 25 years, building this chain of hotels. And the method that he would use is what he called the magazine method, which is whenever he opened a boutique hotel, he and his team would figure out the magazine that would sort of symbolize and guide their approach to running the hotel and the way they design things. And each hotel had a different magazine. So to give you an example, there's one in San Francisco called the Renaissance, which was their first hotel, and the magazine they chose was the Rolling Stone, kind of like rocker-type folks. And there's actually a new one in Palo Alto, one of the last ones Chip did before he went off to Airbnb, and the magazine they used was Wired magazine. So this idea of sort of local customization is important. Just one quick sort of caveat, and maybe in the questions we can talk about this, but there's lots of elements to this decision, but one of the key elements that I always kind of worry about is that this notion of all of us being able to do whatever we want sounds just great, but there's quite a few situations where people feel so snowflake special that they're not going to do stuff even if it's in the best interest of the clients and the organizations and possibly themselves because they don't like being told what to do. And a great example is in medicine, and in particular you can see on the slide, there was this great story that Atul Gawande tells in the New Yorker. A guy named Dr. John Wright spent years essentially battling his colleagues and convincing them that when it came to replacing knees, so doing knee replacement surgery, that they should standardize the hardware they put in and surgical techniques and anesthesia techniques and recovery techniques. And eventually he kind of won the battle, and you can see the statistics cut costs by 50%, a whole bunch of other positive outcomes. but you know, many of his colleagues still sort of despise him for making him conform. So that's always an issue with Catholicism and Buddhism. One of the advantages of Buddhism is that people feel like they have more ownership for it, but this sort of unwanted variation can sometimes undermine performance. Okay, in our final 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is kind of zoom through some of our key principles, and we'll have a couple of takeaways at the end. There's our principles. The first one is one of those things that, you know, and I know many of you are, I guess, like me, kind of like rational types, that if you just make a rational argument, you think people should adopt and spread the mindset that you want them to do, you know, spread the excellence. Lots of evidence that that if you just make a rational argument, human beings tend not to be actually moved particularly to action. And lots of research shows, as Huggy Rao would put it, that what happens is if you want to actually bring about change, spread a mindset, spread new ways of doing things, you combine sort of two things. One is you get the emotions cranked up, you get a hot cause going, and then you link that to specific tangible actions. So to give you one example, we already mentioned the 100,000 Lives campaign. There were two key speakers at their kickoff event. So what they did was they invited about 4,000 key folks in the hospital and medical care industry, so executives from large hospitals, folks from the American Nursing and American Medical Association, so doctors and nurses, folks from key insurance companies, and they said, please sign up for our campaign. We believe it will save many lives. And they had two speakers. One, Sorrel King, described how her daughter Josie died at Johns Hopkins Hospital and said to the folks out in the audience, if this hospital had been in the 100,000 Lives campaign, my daughter would not have died. So that's sort of like hot cause, cool solution. And then another one of the speakers, Sister Mary Jean Ryan, who at that time ran a large Catholic hospital chain, essentially said, speaking of Catholicism, that there was a moral imperative for this. So, you know, sort of like maybe you're risking eternal damnation was sort of my interpretation, so you should join the campaign. So hot cause, cool solution. And just as a quick aside, this idea of hot cause, cool solution, it can also be in the name of something not just saving lives. If you look at the Battle of the Beers, this was one of the key kinds of rhetoric that they used in the early days, the people in the industry, to get the emotions cranked up. And if you read the quote, they talk about Coors and Corona as if it was sort of like this immoral thing. And even though that's sort of silly, it did get the emotions sort of cranked up, and now we have the craft beer movement in the United States. The key thing when you're doing this is you want to arouse collective pride or aggression. Not just one person, when you get sort of that collective emotion is important. All right. The second one is, although it's great to make an argument and to get the emotions cranked up and everything, there's lots and lots of evidence that if you really want to cement a mindset that you're spreading, the most important thing is to get people to live it. Lots of great social psychology studies show that no matter what people are saying to start with, as long as they're kind of marching in the direction you want to go, their minds will change because you get this inconsistency between their behaviors and their beliefs, and they want to close that cognitive dissonance. And to go back to Facebook, when we interviewed Chris Cox, his perspective was, well, we give him a little welcome talk, and in fact, Chris himself usually does the welcome talk at Facebook still, and then what we do is we send them off to make some changes in the site because the way they learn it is by living it. And there's a footnote here, which is really important for those of you who are trying to, if you will, convince other people to change, which is even if they're complaining and don't really want to do it and don't seem to believe in it, that if you can get them marching in the right direction, there's a lot of evidence that they will eventually change as long as they are doing it of their own volition. And one of my favorite examples that we go through in some detail in the book is one of our heroes and friends, Bonnie SIMI. You can see her there at the controls of a plane. Well, Bonnie's a senior executive at JetBlue Airlines, also a three-time Olympian, and she's also still an active pilot, so sort of a superwoman type, and she's amazing. And some of us may know that JetBlue had all sorts of problems, especially in 2007, where when storms hit airports, they actually at one point had a couple thousand people sitting on planes at Kennedy for as long as 8 or 10 hours. Terrible sort of PR fiasco, and also their system wasn't working that well when a storm hit, for example. So Bonnie led after some failed attempts to fix it by senior executives who brought in consultants or tried to do top-down changes, she led an effort where the way it started was she brought essentially 40 people in a room from all different parts of the company, pilots, people who did operations, flight attendants, reservations agents, all sorts of people, and had them map the process of closing and then reopening Kennedy Airport in New York when a storm hit. In every place where there was a problem that needed to be fixed, they put a pink Post-it note. And the process was, we'll get rid of the pink Post-it notes and then the system will work. So she has the first group spend the day doing this, and then she asked them, so how many of you think this will work? Not one of them raised their hands. But she had them kind of marching in the right direction. She said, can I get you to come back for just one more time? And then can I get you to nominate a friend? And after a few months, they kept marching in that direction, and two things happened. Was they started believing it, and the second thing that happened is all signs are that they fixed the system as a result of this sort of bottom-up sort of system that Bonnie led. Okay. The next one is cut cognitive load, but deal with necessary complexity. Lots of evidence that when you weight down people with excessive load, put weight on our brains, that we lose our will, and also we tend to do everything badly. And some of us, as somebody who has like kids who claim to be digital natives and therefore they can multitask, there's all sorts of evidence, especially from our dear friend, the late Cliff Nass at Stanford, that nobody can multitask, and even multitasking makes everybody stupid, no matter how smart they might be in other ways. And even it turns out that heavy multitaskers are worse at multitasking than light multitaskers because we have cognitive limits. And one little experiment I love that shows that especially when you give people cognitive load, they sort of lose the will to do the right thing. Shiv, our colleague from the Stanford Business School, did a famous study where he had people memorize either 2-digit numbers or 7-digit numbers and walk down a hallway to report it to an experimenter at the other end. They were offered cake and fruit. Those who were offered, those who had the 7-digit number to remember, 50% ate 50% more cake. And presuming that fruit is better for you than cake, what happened was the load led them to sort of lose the will to do the right thing. Now, organizations do this to us all the time. Just to give you a quick example, and no, you're not supposed to be able to read and interpret this quickly. I don't think anybody could. Some years back, 5 or 6 years back, Intuit tried to have a design for delight or design movement. And this picture, this messy picture with this very long title, this was what they sort of rolled out to employees. And they had Scott Cook, who is the co-founder of the company, and some other senior executives present it to hundreds of employees. And they had two reactions. One was they couldn't understand it, and the other was, this too shall pass. So they were presented this way, but they figured out pretty quickly, since these are smart people, that maybe going to something more simple that, if you will, put less cognitive load on people and was more discernible was possible. Now, one thing I like to really emphasize at this point is that I'm not making a simple argument that you need as much simplicity as possible, because there are all sorts of evidence that as organizations grow, and this is a big challenge in scaling, they do need more hierarchy, they do need more structure, and they do need more process. You just want to make it as light as possible. And the reason I have the Ask Larry page there was a great point in Google history early on in about 2002 where Larry decided that he was missing the good old days when it was just him and Sergey and a few folks in a room. They'd grown to 400 and they had all these managers, and he wanted to get rid of the managers. So he did, and for a very short period of time, there was one executive who had a couple hundred engineers reporting to him. Didn't work at all, and Google went back to managers. And if you look at the modern Google, great company that it is, the first-line manager is viewed as one of the most important people at Google. So they tried the experiment of, if you will, subtracting too much. And again, maybe we can talk about this some in the Q&A. Some of the basic guidelines in striking the balance, I think, comes especially from Chris Fry, one of the scaling heroes in the book. He's now head of engineering at Twitter, did some great scaling at Salesforce.com, and his perspective is that what your job is as a leader or a manager of either a group or a large organization is to use the hierarchy to destroy bad bureaucracy. Because it's not that organizations don't need things that are really trappings of bureaucracy, structure, process, titles, managers. They just need as few as possible. And Chris has a great test, which is that if it feels like the people are walking in muck, that's a sign that I've got too much structure. One other quick thing which is that there's a lot of evidence that as your organization grows, one of the most important things for you to do is especially to keep the teams small. And essentially, you've got the examples there that Navy SEALs fire teams have 4 members, so do McKinsey engagement teams. And essentially what the evidence shows, especially if you go from a team of 4 or 5 to 10 or 11, that the amount of time that people spend on coordination tasks goes up exponentially, and also the amount that they have dysfunctional sort of relationship problems in the organization or in the team also goes up. And the example I like to give is, think of the difference between going to dinner with 3 or 4 people. You can keep a conversation, kind of keep track of people's moods. If you're trying to do that with 10 or 11 people, it ends up being impossible to have one conversation that really works for everyone if there's real interdependence. Okay, so I've got 2 more. Connect people and cascade excellence. And let's go through this one quickly in the name of time. The basic idea here is that if you want to spread excellence, you can't just spread a thin coat, so it just has one speech or a bit of training. You've got to create a real deep pocket of excellence and spread it from one to the other. That's what happened in the 100,000 Lives campaign. Once a hospital became expert, it led the others. To give you another quick example, one of our favorite ones is in Iraq. There was a group of soldiers who figured out that when the bad guys threw an RKG-3 hand grenade, special kind of hand grenade at a truck, if it hit something soft, it wouldn't blow up. They put a trampoline on their truck, and it worked. They bounced off. So pretty soon, through something called the Army Lessons Learned, that was spread throughout the Iraq theater. Another more serious one, a more intense spread of excellence that we studied at a pharmaceutical firm called WYETH. What they would do is they do these mini transformations, and you can see the example on the slide, where they'd really get one group really, really humming, and then somebody like FIFI would then lead the effort to spread it to the next, and then the next, and the next part of the plant, and then you end up with this transformation where we see where production almost doubles as a result of spreading excellence from where it is to where it isn't, but in an intense sort of way. Okay, now our final principle, and maybe our favorite, which is that, and this is sort of a play on the great business book, Good to Great, by Jim Collins. It's our assertion, if you want to spread excellence, it's more important to go from bad to great than good to great, because bad is stronger than good. There's all sorts of evidence that if you look at just an incredible list of bad behaviors and bad people and bad actions and bad mood, stealing, corruption, anything you look at that's bad, it's so much stronger than good that if you don't get rid of it, you're going to have problems spreading excellence in your organizations. Just 2 quick examples. It turns out that if you have a bad interaction with one of your coworkers or with your boss, it packs 5 times the wallop on mood and productivity is a good one. Or some other research, if you've got one deadbeat or jerk in your organization, it undermines performance by 30 or 40%. So when we look at scaling, people are really good at it. They're always thinking, like, what's getting in the way? So one quick example, Barry Fell, the guy who was a guest in our scaling class, he took over a chain of, at that time, about 180 retail stores on the West Coast. There were some in Texas and other parts of the western United States. And in the process, he visited almost everyone, in part to figure out which ones to close, but also to spread the message that there's certain bad behaviors we've got to get rid of. And 2 things he really focused on was, do they greet me and other customers? And 2, are the bathrooms clean? Because his theory was, if you could just get rid of those simple bad behaviors, dirty bathrooms and not greeting, that things would get better in the chain. And in fact, it worked. He turned it around and it was sold to Bath & Beyond recently. And another example, a more simple one to sort of get back to the sort of cognitive overload case, our buddy Chris Fry, when he was brought in as head of engineering at Twitter, he actually faced quite an interesting challenge. And many of us may know who use Twitter. There was a point where the fail whale was coming up constantly, and his job was, among other things, to get rid of the fail whale. And he noticed in his first meetings that instead of talking to people who were looking at their cell phones, his engineering team, so what he does now is he collects them. And to give you some confirmation that I'm not just BSing you, a while back, one of the members of his senior team sent out a Twitter and sort of put my Twitter handles Work Matters and put Work Matters in it, and I'll interpret it for you. CH Fry rule, cell phones must be deposited with RJ San Jose. That's his executive assistant prior to the start of the meeting, and you can see the cell phones on the table. So the key thing about getting this bad is stronger than good stuff, it isn't just big bad behavior, so it can be little things that you got to chip away at all the time. All right, so those are the scaling principles that we talked about. There's more in the book on scaling up excellence. Let me make kind of a final wrap-up point and tell a little story, and then we're going to hear a little bit from Ryan. So a kind of parting thought. One of the things that actually disturbs me, well, and it's a sin that I probably commit myself, and maybe I've committed in this little session here, is that very often when we tell stories about organizations that change or go through transformation, including scaling, it sounds like this beautiful, smooth process where people actually know what they're doing and they're kind of happily moving along at every stage. But at least if you look at cases of where it actually happens, or if you're in the middle of one yourself, there are always long stretches of confusion. There's periods where things go wrong. It seems messed up. And as the quote from David Kelly says, one of my heroes, it turns out that this is just sort of like life as usual in organizations. And to be able to scale excellence or to do any other sort of real organizational change where you're doing something different, you've got to accept that in some ways that you clean up things as well as you can, but you're also in the middle of a manageable mess, and you've got to keep muddling forward the best you can, even though things aren't going particularly well at the moment. And just one little tip, since I've got another minute or two, that I would like to emphasize is a little trick that I've seen David use and is also supported by some awfully good social psychology, is that one way to get people to stop focusing on how difficult things are and to stop being freaked out and upset is to get them not so much to think about now, but to think about the past or the future. So turn their attention to the time in the past when they faced a similarly difficult situation and were able to overcome it. So that idea of sort of, the retrospection might not even be accurate, but it helps them get through it. Or to have them focus on the future and to get people motivated about a dream or vision that lies ahead. So ironically, one of the great things that leaders do to help people muddle through the mess of scaling and other sorts of organizational changes is to have them switch attention away from the never-ending now, the perpetual present tense we're all trapped in, to a brighter future in times when they got through the problem in the past. Okay, so that's the end of our official webinar, and it's time to turn it over to Ryan.
Bob, thank you so much. Really, very much appreciate it. Just before we leave, wanted just to make sure that you have Professor Sutton's information, his blog. Again, this is his most recent publication, the Scaling Up Excellence with Professor Hayagriva Rao. So if you're interested in more, we strongly encourage you to either follow Bob or get the book. And I think our first question there is, if problems pop up when team sizes grow beyond 6, how do you create an efficient hierarchy for a large organization? Would it become a huge tree?
So it is sort of interesting because one thing that people talk about a lot is this notion would have organizations be as flat as possible. And so one thing that sort of helps to think about is organizations, and I would sort of give you everything from Walmart to the U.S. Army to McKinsey, the consulting firm, that they do have multiple layers. But if you will, the sort of finding unit where the action actually really happens tends to be in 4-person teams. And so what you'll have is as flat a hierarchy as you can possibly get away with, but you don't have to have 4 all the way up. You actually can structure an organization in part by doing 2 things that reduce the need for sort of close supervision and therefore lots of hierarchy. The first thing, and this gets back to the mindset stuff, so that when people are kind of all on the same page about how we're supposed to behave, what's sacred and what's taboo here, you actually don't need as much close supervision. You probably do need some close supervision. You do need managers to do things like provide some direction, to deal with the difficult team members, and to do other sort of standard sort of things that are always part of organizations. And the other thing that we're learning is that the best organizations, one thing that they do to eliminate the need for so many levels and so much close supervision is that when people are on similar time rhythms, and that's one of the organizations that we studied for the book, Salesforce.com, was actually Chris Fry's work in terms of helping to turn around their development organization. What he did was he put all the teams, and these were small 5-person engineering teams, he put them on a rhythm where they had daily stand-up meetings. Every week they had to have a prototype. Every couple of weeks they had to have a demo. And then they would, it was actually every 4 weeks they'd have to have a demo, and then every 4 months they'd all release a product together. And what happens when people are in the same time rhythm, you don't have to watch them as closely because they sort of all know what to do and when to hurry, and they also know the pressures that others are under, so the collaboration and cooperation is smooth. So yes, there is some tension between the notion that smaller teams are more effective and it might lead to more hierarchy, but organizations do find ways around it. And in particular, what the best organizations do, it's interesting to look at Walmart actually, because Walmart is huge as an organization as it is. From the sales associate on the floor to the CEO, it's only about 8 levels. So it's actually quite bureaucratic. We all know it's a very bureaucratic organization, but it's also quite efficient because they sort of break people into small teams in groups, but they create as little hierarchy as possible in between. But that's a great question, and there's a constant tension between it. And one sort of final word I would emphasize, there's a lot of rhetoric out there that flatter and decentralized and empowerment is always better. And the answer in that case is to be very careful because there's sometimes when you do need some more hierarchy. Okay, another question.
Okay, go for it.
Well, I like this one. Okay, when do you get rid of deadbeats? How do you realize they're affecting the team, or you should take time to try to professionally develop them first? So my perspective is I can't tell you exactly the time when it's time to get rid of a deadbeat, and in fact, in some organizations, it might be so difficult to get rid of them that you may not even have that option, to be perfectly honest. But if you look at research on what the most effective managers do, what they tend to do is they tend to nip bad behavior in the bud, and when they see bad behavior, what they'll do is they'll react to it quickly and give people negative feedback, a little guidance, a little coaching, then maybe a formal warning, and if it's possible to fire them. And there's actually quite good research that when leaders act that way, not only do they run teams that perform more effectively, they actually are more well-liked by the people that they lead. In terms of the development stuff, one thing that's actually sort of interesting that I always think is an important footnote is to go to the Google playbook. And one thing Google, which is they're incredibly evidence-based, one thing they've figured out is sometimes when you have actually a poorly performing employee or manager, that sometimes it's because of regression to the mean and other forces, that if they just take the person and put them in a different team, they sometimes improve dramatically, about 25 or 30% of the time, because sometimes there's just something about the context that doesn't fit their skills and personalities. So I really like that idea in terms of nipping the bad behavior in the bud, rather than really working on changing the person's style and personality and fitting better in the team. Maybe the first order of business is, well, let's put them somewhere else if you can do it and see if they can thrive in that situation. So we have time for one more question.
I think we got. If you can answer it quickly, we have time for one more.
Okay. Could you comment on the role of error in driving insights and innovation? It's absolute. I don't like the word error. The reason I don't like the word error, I would prefer the word failure, mistake, things that don't work out. There's absolutely no way to do anything new without doing things that don't turn out well. And my friend Diego Rodriguez, who's actually he's also in our course on leading innovation, he has a great saying, which is failure sucks but instructs. And in the best teams and organizations that are doing innovative work, they fail constantly. But the main difference I would make is the ones that are led well. They make mistakes and learn from them and therefore make different mistakes. And the ones that are bad, it's like a kabuki dance. They make the same mistake over and over again. So to me, that's the diagnostic difference. And I wish I had more time for your comments and for your questions. And I love this long, beautiful list. But it's 10 o'clock and we must end on time. So I think I've got to turn it over to somebody else to wrap it up.
With that, I want to again thank Professor Sutton for his time and insights. I know that I'm challenged to go back and try to do things differently, and we'll see how effective I am. At this time then, I'd like to say thank you for joining us.
Thank you.